morning. I'm Kim McCleary, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. Thank you all for your participation in our live streams and your ongoing support. I also want to take this time to extend a heartfelt thank you to our own Dan Schnur, who has tirelessly and generously given of his own time to the Council and Town Hall. As many of you know, pre-COVID, Dan was moderating monthly in-person discussions at our Acacia Cafe. When we pivoted to live streams, Dan was the very first person we talked to about hosting a weekly live stream, which turned into this politics in the time of coronavirus. But in addition to that, he's also voluntarily moderating numerous interviews with key leaders such as Adam Schiff, Tim Scott, and Kevin McCarthy, just to name a few. We are so fortunate in Dan to have such a skillful and knowledgeable moderator. He needs to honor our mission as a nonpartisan organization to acquire better information and clarity on key issues for our audiences in a manner that maintains a fair and measured manner that ensures that we will continue to be able to attract a broad array of speakers with diverse perspectives. Dan expertly threads that needle during his interviews, which also need to be produced in a constrained time frame, which is another challenge, I know. So Dan, on behalf of my staff and I, our members and our audiences, thank you so much for everything you do and all your support for the Council Town Hall. Now, without further ado, no, I know I probably embarrassed you, so, but it needed to be said. We say this amongst ourselves, but everybody needs to know how much you do and how much time you give to the organization. So thank you.
Well, you are very kind, Kim. And as we've talked about before, I think this is something that many of us really get something out of, these conversations that are not necessarily directed toward one party or one ideology or another. And again, I'll take a minute to thank you for your leadership of the organization, and also to thank Jessica and Claire and the entire LA World Affairs Council Town Hall team that works so hard to bring our members and our guests such high level and impressive programming throughout the year. So thank you. Back at you.
And now for politics in the time of coronavirus. Dan has three, I mean, it's hard to narrow this down to three topics sometimes, Dan, but highlights from the convention so far, the roles of the progressive, and Biden's big night tonight. Can't wait. For those of you, there may not be any new people, but if you haven't participated in Dan's program, we'll be taking questions in 20 minutes. There's a panel on the right-hand side of your screen where you can type in your questions at any time. The sooner the better. Jessica DeGanzik, our VP of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion of today's program. She has a horrific job too, very challenging. She gets hundreds of questions starting before the program and through the program, which she has to cohesively organize. So we try to address all of your themes of your questions in a very short time. So Jessica, kudos to everything you do in the Q&A. Without any further ado, Dan, I'm handing this over to you. Can't wait.
Kim, thanks again. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. As Kim mentioned, and as we've mentioned throughout the week, today's webinar is going to concentrate exclusively on the Democratic National Convention, of course. But if, of course, you have questions on other topics, once Jessica and I shift into that portion of the program, I'm always happy to do my best to answer them as well. And then next week, in the interest of partisan fairness, of course, we'll devote the program to the Republican National Convention. But because they're the party out of the White House, the Democrats go first. So let's start there. The first topic, as Kim mentioned, is, of course, regardless of which side of the aisle you happen to fall, the political parties are making history this month. And what we're seeing this week, and we'll see again next week, is the first online political conventions in history. And so before I talk at any length about what I thought were the highlights of the last few days, let's start instead with our first question, Claire, and ask all of you as participants what you thought of the online convention. How did the Democrats do with a virtual remote convention as opposed to one, the traditional type that takes place in person? Did you find this to be better? Did you find this to be worse? Or did you find this to be the same? And we'll see in just a minute what your thoughts are. Obviously, this isn't something that the Democrats or the Republicans chose to do, but under the circumstances, it'll be interesting to see what your first thoughts were about whether the Democrats pulled this off as well, better, or worse. How are our responses coming, Claire? Well, look at this. 73%, almost 3/4 of you, thought that an online convention is better than in person. Really interesting. Only 15% said it was worse. I'm guessing those are people who've gone into the conventions and been on the floor for all that excitement in years past. And then 12% said it was just the same. So that's really interesting. The large majority of our members and of our guests thought that the online convention, even though it was something the Democrats might not have chosen, was actually better than the in-person variety. Very interesting. And I have to tell you, it does, I think, at least, that it does seem to have worked. It does seem to have worked pretty well. The program was somewhat tighter. It was faster. The speeches were shorter and more on point. And of course, the party had more control over the speakers, because if you record a speech in advance, you can't go over the time limit. It also seemed to me, and we'll see whether the Republicans are able to pull this off next week as well, is that the party had more control over the convention, or particularly those aspects of the convention that were seen by the American people, because the networks seemed much more reticent, much less likely to cut away from the formal program for their own analysis. They still looked for opportunities to do that, of course. You know, what would these conventions be without the pundit panels? Yeah. But it did seem like a much larger percentage of the planned program was seen by the viewing audience than would have been the case in a more traditional onstage auditorium setting. Couple things stuck out to me as highlights. I thought the roll call of the states was very interesting and in fact very stirring. The fact that each state chose who their speakers would be, of course, but also the backdrop from which they'd speak, I think added a really nice visual allure to the traditional roll call that takes place on the convention floor, which, while in some ways very exciting, has become a little bit formulaic over the last century or so. I'll admit I was somewhat skeptical in advance of the group keynote speech. They had, I believe, 17 young leaders, elected officials, all speaking in sort of a crowdsourced keynote speech. I thought that sounded a little bit awkward, but I actually thought it ended up being a lot more interesting in keeping the viewer's attention to a much greater degree than a single person keynote speech. I think it was easier online. I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts as well when we get to questions. I thought it was easier online to convey a more personal message from the speaker to the audience. Michelle Obama, in particular, on Monday night, I thought did an excellent job of adjusting to this format, talking to the audience rather than shouting as you might be doing from a podium in a crowded convention hall. And I think that particularly in a time of crisis, of COVID, of a recession, of this renewed debate over race relations, the balloons and the festivities might have seemed a little bit off tone anyway. And this format helped, I think helped set and reinforce the appropriate mood for times like these. The downside, of course, is there's no way, as hard as they tried, to show the enthusiasm and excitement of supporters the way you can in a convention hall. They tried as hard as they could. But I have to admit, I felt a little bit bad for Kamala Harris last night, having just given a speech in an extraordinary moment in American history, and then turning to a video screen to watch people clap, which did seem a little bit awkward. And similarly, when Vice President Biden came on stage, the two of them socially distancing while necessary seemed a little bit awkward as well. I would suggest that the two most important speeches of the week so far And obviously, just like next week's Donald Trump speech will be the most important speech for the Republicans, Biden's obviously will be the most important for the Democrats. But tonight I would tell you, or at least after the first 3 nights, I would tell you, I think the Obamas stole the show. Both Michelle Obama on Monday night and Barack Obama last night, both had been pushed for the last 3.5, 4 years to take on Trump more forcefully, to criticize him in stronger language than they'd been willing to. And the message that the Obamas had sent out to their friends and supporters was they were not going to do that until or unless they felt the time was right. And they obviously decided that the time was right this week. And my own feeling is that by withholding criticism of that level until now, their words were even more impactful than if it was the type of tone and approach that they'd been taking over the last few years. Michelle Obama was more personal, Barack Obama was more presidential, but in different ways. I think they are unquestionably the most impactful messengers of the convention so far. The two most discordant speeches, I guess I would call them, to me, were the Clintons. And Bill Clinton on video seemed almost trapped, deprived of the almost organic feel that he has for interacting with an audience. Bill Clintons, the George W. Bushes, the Ronald Reagans, the John F. Kennedys, the best presidential orators tend to be those who have a sense of the audience and can react to them in real time. And a pre-taped 5-minute speech from Bill Clinton by video, he seemed almost trapped. And Hillary Clinton, while I think she handled the circumstance somewhat better than Bill, they both seemed almost like voices from another era, and both represented a mark as to how much the Democratic Party has changed, not just since Bill Clinton left office 20 years ago, but even over the last 4 years since Hillary's campaign. Kamala Harris, well, Kamala made history, of course. I thought it was a solid speech. Her personal story was very compelling. I thought the policy and political portions were more standard, nothing wrong with them, but nothing particularly exceptional. But of course, who she represents, the first woman of color to be on a major party ticket, that was the history of last night. And so it's not surprising that her personal story was the most impactful portion of her presentation. I talked a few minutes ago about how more personal messages seem to work better on video than in the convention hall. And I think that was particularly effective when the non-politicians spoke. You may remember the young woman from Arizona who on Monday night talked about her father's passing because of COVID. You may have heard the 11-year-old girl last night reading the letter she'd written to President Trump about her mother. Or the introduction of Kamala Harris last night by her stepdaughter and her sister and niece. To me, those were very compelling moments that would have been much, much harder to pull off in a traditional setting. So the key point I'd offer to you, and then I have another question for you, is it's been sort of a quiet, acknowledged secret in politics for some time that the conventions had become sort of artifacts of a different era, 20th century traditions that hadn't adapted all that well to the new era. They become overly scripted and not that interesting. And your response to our first poll question certainly demonstrated your thoughts on that. Audiences just don't watch long speeches anymore. And so the short videos help. And so maybe the video-centric version of a convention is overdue. If we can, I'm virtually certain that we'll go back to in-person conventions again in 2024. But I think it's also worth noting that there'll be a lot of lessons learned from this experiment in both parties that'll be adopted that'll dramatically change conventions going forward. Here's my question for you, and Claire, if we can put up the second question. My question for you is, are conventions still necessary? In other words, do hundreds of delegates need to gather from around the country every 4 years in order to nominate their president? Or can this ritual be accomplished just as effectively online and remotely? So are conventions still necessary? Should we go back to in-person conventions, or in not just a television, but in a small screen era? Is this our future? Let's see your thoughts. Wow, how about that? I have to admit I'm a little bit surprised. 41% say conventions are still necessary. 59%, a pretty strong majority, say that it's not something we have to go back to. Like I said, my prediction is that in 4 years we'll see a much more melded version of the two. So the 41% of you who want conventions will still get something that you like, probably not just as much. And we'll see how the combined version works, and with any luck, we'll be talking about it then. Let's go on to the second topic relating to the convention. And that topic, that question, is where were the progressives? And the answer, not just about the most liberal voices in the Democratic Party, but the youngest voices in the Democratic Party, is where were they? Well, for the most part, if they were around at all, they were speaking in the first hour of the convention program each night before the networks came in. So many of you, I'm guessing, like us, we watched the convention on cable television. I'm guessing many of you watched it online as well. So you saw all 2 hours. But as I think you probably also noticed, the traditional broadcast networks only covered the last hour, from 10 to 11 East Coast time, from 7 to 8 Pacific each night. And so what ended up happening, I thought, was sort of a junior varsity approach, where the convention organizers had people speaking in that first hour who they knew needed to speak, and then people speaking in the second hour during the broadcast window in prime time for the speakers they really wanted to get heard. And it did seem like progressives and younger people got somewhat shunted to the side. The most obvious example of that, both ideologically and generationally, is Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York City. She received 1 minute to address the Democratic National Convention. That's only 1 minute more than I got. So let's put up our third question, Claire, and let's ask what our audience members think. Should AOC have gotten more time at the convention? And before you answer yes or no, I'd ask you to take a look at the sort of partial explanations we've provided. Do you think, yes, she should have gotten more time because her youth and progressivism helped motivate the Democratic base? Or do you think, no, a minute was just about right because the party needed to target swing voters with more centrist speakers? And certainly they did that. John Kasich, Colin Powell, Cindy McCain, there was no shortage of effort to make sure that voters in the center of the political spectrum heard from voters who might move them. And it did seem like a much greater emphasis than either the left or younger Democrats. So let's see the results. 36%, a little bit over 1/3, said more time for Ocasio-Cortez and presumably for other progressive and younger candidates in order to motivate the base. But almost 2/3 of you, 64%, say no. This election is about winning the center, and that means more. That means older speakers, and it means more centrist speakers, and even more Republicans than maybe a lot of Democratic delegates would have liked. So very, very interesting response. No, it's interesting though, and I'm going to talk about this primarily from a generational rather than ideological perspective today, because we've talked a lot over the last several weeks about the left-center strategic tension within the Democratic Party. So let's talk about this generationally. Joe Biden talks about himself frequently as a transition to a new generation of political leadership. But we really haven't seen that future this week. Think about who we saw the first 3 nights: the Clintons, the Obamas, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, even the celebrity hosts, Eva Longoria tonight, Julia Louis-Dreyfus. These are the kind of entertainers who people of my generation tend to be familiar with, as opposed to younger. Although it is worth giving the vice president credit where it's due, he did do an interview for Elle magazine recently with Cardi B. And if you don't know who Cardi B is, then you are almost certainly a portion of the target audience of the Biden campaign. I would say that except for Harris's vice presidential acceptance speech last night and the Young Leaders keynote address that I mentioned earlier, were really the only high-profile efforts to reach out to young people. Now, to be fair, millennials and Gen Z voters are less likely to turn into a television production, a TV party convention, that even with the online innovations, can seem like a 20th century relic, as I talked about earlier. And Biden's people might have decided that the best way to reach those younger generations is not through a television program, but through social media outreach in the weeks ahead. But I have to say, the convention felt like more than just a tactical decision to target voters who still watch television rather than smartphones. Biden, the central premise of Biden's candidacy has always been his ability to win back the older working class voters who defected to Trump 4 years ago. And it's becoming more and more clear that those voters will be his top targeting priority as the campaign moves forward in the fall. The selection of Kamala Harris, as we talked about last week, appears now to be having more of a motivational impact for female voters and for voters from minority communities than for young people. And although Biden has kept a somewhat limited public schedule, when he has gone out in public, those events seem to be scheduled with an older swing audience in mind. Now, we know that young people vote in much smaller numbers than older generations. And so this may end up being a very smart targeting strategy. And it's entirely possible that we'll see the Biden campaign more aggressively target young people in any number of ways over the course of the next several weeks. But public opinion polls still show that younger voters are much less motivated for Biden than their parents and grandparents are. They represented, as most of you know, these young people represented the majority of the demonstrators who came out after George Floyd's death. And so the question is whether they will translate the energy they displayed in the demonstrations, whether they'll translate that energy into voting. And it appears right now, we'll see if it's the right decision or not, that Biden and his campaign have decided that they're going to let Trump be the primary motivator for young people. But for his campaign, they don't seem to be as high of a priority. Last topic, and then we'll go to your questions in just a couple of minutes. The third topic, of course, is tonight's speech, the acceptance speech that Joe Biden gives. This is the biggest night of Joe Biden's life. He's run for president. He's run for president twice before, almost ran in 2016. And now he's his party's nominee and is only one step from the presidency. And so the stakes are always high for a speech like this for a party nominee. But I would argue that they're especially high for Biden, and I'll take just a minute to tell you why. Since gaining the nomination, which, as you remember, occurred almost simultaneously with the COVID shutdown, Biden has kept a very low profile. And over those months, has risen in the polls to his current position of advantage, not because of things that he's been saying and doing, but because the president's words and actions have been discouraging support for him and moving any number of voting groups from Trump toward Biden. So by keeping a lower profile, Biden is recognizing the old adage. They say you never interfere with the enemy when he's in the process of destroying himself. Now, whether Trump is destroying himself or whether that's somewhat of an overstatement is something we'll find out in a few months. But while it's a smart strategy for Biden to keep a lower profile while Trump is having such difficulty with the COVID challenge and with the challenge of this discussion on race relations our country's been engaging in, it's a smart strategy, but it's a risky one. Because Biden, to a large degree, is still not very well known by the American people. And I know this seems odd because anyone who would join, and I mean this in a good way, anyone who would join a webinar called Politics in the Time of Coronavirus in the middle of the day on a weekday obviously follows politics very closely. But the average American voter, aside from the fact that Joe Biden was Barack Obama's vice president, doesn't know about him yet. And what we've learned over years of following politics is that candidates who are not well defined in the eyes of the voters are more vulnerable to negative attacks from the opposition. And that stands to reason. If you know a lot about a woman or a man and someone criticizes that person, you're not as likely to accept that criticism because you have information that suggests the otherwise. But if you don't know much about that candidate, if you don't know much about that individual, and someone offers you critical or unappealing information about them, well, you're much more likely to accept it, if only because you don't have any information to counter it. So tonight is Biden's chance, his first chance, his best chance, to get himself known to the American people. One, because obviously he wants their support for president and wants them to understand what his goals are for the country should he be elected. But also because the better known that Biden can become, the more defined he can be in the eyes of the voters, the more protected he is against the attacks and the criticisms that will continue to come from the other side. So we'll see how the speech goes tonight. And obviously we'll talk about it a little bit less next week, even though we'll be focusing on the Republican convention as well. But what I'm going to do instead, but what I'd like to do right now is to ask you one last question. And the question is this: should Biden's top priority tonight be to emphasize his own record and agenda or to criticize Trump? It's pretty clear that up until tonight, the Democrats have emphasized their criticism of Trump as what they believe is the most effective motivator and persuader for the votes they need in order to win. But how about Biden? Should he leave that criticism to his running mate, to the Obamas, to other supporters, and talk about his own record and agenda? Or recognizing the disagreements that the majority of the American people have with the current president, should he reinforce that message? Because he can do so in a much more forceful and visible way than anyone can do it on his behalf. Let's see what you guys think. 92% emphasize his own record and agenda. 8% criticize Trump. I suspect it'll be a mixture of both, but my guess, and it is just a guess, is that Biden and his advisors are thinking along the same lines as you are. One other thing about tonight's speech, and this goes back to the challenge of a virtual online convention. We talked earlier about the experience for the viewers, for the audience, of watching a speech that takes place on a screen rather than in a convention center. Well, it's a lot harder for a speaker to give a talk without that kind of audience reaction either. And I talked about how in particular Bill Clinton seemed to struggle with that. Well, Joe Biden, like Bill Clinton, like George W. Bush, is a politician who's very emotive. And when he's speaking from a podium, as opposed to meeting with people in a one-on-one situation, which is his most comfortable setting, he takes in cues from the audience and adjusts his speaking accordingly, because he is at his best when he's talking in very personal and emotive terms. And it's a lot harder to connect with a screen than it is with women and men sitting right in front of you. So this is a different type of speech for Joe Biden to give. And it's going to be it might be a more difficult one. He tends to be more improvisational. He tends to be a storyteller. And that's a tougher thing to do on a screen than in an auditorium. Obviously, his speech tonight won't win or lose the election for him, but the right speech could strengthen his position considerably as a frontrunner, less vulnerable to attack. And a difficult speech, a difficult night that doesn't go well, would leave him more exposed going forward. But anyway, I've gone a little bit long today, and Jessica, I apologize for that, but lots to cover from the convention. And so maybe we can switch gears now and hear what other people are thinking about and want to talk about.
Thank you so much. Yes, we've got a ton of questions coming in. A lot of people had questions about the impact of the convention to progressives and younger voters. So I'm going to dive into those a little bit, if that's okay with you. This person says, what Dan says about the convention skewing away from younger voters was obvious in the reaction of my 2 teens to the convention, who were put off by going with Kasich, etc., and giving very little time to AOC. Should Dems be concerned that they're taking progressives for granted here and that turnout for their younger base may be an issue?
Okay. Well, any successful campaign, of course, has to do both. You have to motivate your existing supporter base, and you have to reach out to persuade undecided voters. I don't know that the Democrats, I didn't mean to suggest that the Democrats are ignoring progressives and young people. they're just getting less emphasis at this convention than those outreach efforts are. As I said a little bit earlier, Jessica, my own thought is that the Biden campaign is, in addition to relying on Kamala Harris to speak to those young people and to speak to other portions of the party base, I think to a large degree they're also relying on Donald Trump. And public opinion polls shows that Gen Z and millennials are far more disposed against Trump than any other generation. And so the Biden campaign is clearly presuming that even without ongoing directed messaging, that those young people will not switch sides. Well, they're right about that. Those young people aren't going to vote for Donald Trump for re-election. The question is if they are going to vote. And over the next 75 days, party leaders like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are going to play a critical role in motivating those young people. I agree with the questioner that they may have missed an opportunity by not giving her and some other younger voices more time at the convention, even understanding their need to reach out to the political center.
Thank you. So as a follow-up to that, this question is, do you think the anti-Trump narrative will galvanize the younger voter?
It may. And we'll go back to the point I was making a moment ago. The message for young people is not a persuasive message. It's a motivational message. And what the Biden campaign seems to have concluded is that while Biden is now espousing some policies that might be of some interest and excitement to young people, the primary source of motivation for them to turn out is not a positive message regarding Joe Biden, but a negative message regarding Donald Trump. And even though many of the speakers over the first few nights of the convention in that primetime hour were of an older era, the content of their speeches was very much focused on Trump. And that's designed to have a motivational impact. So the subtext, if you will, is something along the lines of, well, Biden might not be as enthusiastic about single-payer healthcare and a Green New Deal as you are, but do you really want another 4 years of Trump? Better get excited, young people, and better turn out. Again, I think that's a better message to come from younger voices, but it is very much the message that the Obamas and others have spent the week delivering.
Thank you. This question asks, are young people watching? Their votes will be critical in the election. I'm very interested in the data tracking, whether the on-media format this year is having an impact. And another person in the webinar said that she thinks that they're probably reading highlights and summaries on social media.
Okay, so two good points. We know that viewership for the convention is down tremendously from 4 years ago. And we know that it has declined each night. Like, as people get a sense for what an online convention looks like, they seem to be a little bit less enthusiastic about it, although obviously we'll see if tonight changes that. It is entirely possible, likely, that young people are following this convention through social media, the same way that young people no longer watch the Tonight Show or late night, but rather get the best clips on social media the next morning. We'll have data for that by next week, and we'll set aside a little bit of time to share about it. But my instinct is that the questioner is right, is that young people who are paying attention are doing so indirectly rather than directly. But the potential concern for the Democrats is not that a Gen Z voter or millennial voter is watching clips on their smartphone. Their concern should be that they're not watching at all.
Someone asked, why do you refer to millennials and Gen Zers as the base of the Democratic Party when they're not reliable voters?
Well, I should clarify, and I'm glad the questioner gave me a chance to do so. I'd say that young people are a portion of the base of the Democratic Party. And as I mentioned at the beginning of that second topic, I was talking about progressives more broadly, but because we've talked about that left-center dynamic in the Democratic Party in weeks past, today I chose to focus on the generational aspect. But the questioner is exactly right. female voters, single voters, voters from minority communities, and other voters who supported Sanders or Warren or more left-leaning candidates in the primary, they all comprise a significant portion of the Democratic base. And while today we're talking about young people, they are just one portion of that. And as I said a little bit earlier, I do believe that while Harris might not be having the impact with young people that might benefit the campaign, it's very clear that she is motivating other aspects of the party base, primarily female voters and voters from communities of color. So in fairness to her, or to any presidential or vice presidential nominee, no one person can get everyone excited. But my point is that the Harris selection and other approaches the campaign has been taking to date do seem targeted at other portions of the Democratic base, as opposed to young people. And the questioner's right. That's probably because when push comes to shove, young people are less likely to turn out in large numbers this fall than other portions of the base.
Thank you. This questioner asks, so what does Biden do to become better known in this time of coronavirus? Trump as president can hog the airwaves. And so I might kind of throw back to last week's question where somebody asked, if you were a campaign consultant, what advice would you give to President Trump? And so I guess what advice would you give to candidate Joe Biden?
Well, I'm not much more likely to be asked by Joe Biden for advice than I am for Donald Trump, but I'll offer it at least in the hypothetical sense. First thing I would do is I would agree with the questioner's premise, is during a time of COVID-19 and during a time of recession, the percentage of time that most Americans are devoting to campaign politics is smaller. That said, once we get through the conventions and a little bit closer to Election Day, I think that's going to change. And while Trump, no question, has commanded the stage, the largest proportions of the stage for many months now, as the election draws closer, I do think there'll be greater public and media attention and opportunities for Biden. I don't think it'll be difficult for him to get the attention he requires. The question is, once that attention is available to him, how does he take advantage of it? And the point that I was trying to make earlier I was talking specifically about his speech tonight, but I guess I would make it broader advice, is the opportunity is there to raise his profile by talking more about his personal biography and those aspects of his policy agenda that do appeal to both the Democratic base and the swing voters. My point is simply, he needs to be more aggressive about taking advantage of that platform than he has in the past, because while it served him well to keep a low profile over the summer, while Trump was running into such difficulties on the COVID response, I do think going forward that Biden does need to take better advantage of those platforms when available. And I would be surprised if he doesn't, but I understand the temptation to say, hey, we've risen up in the polls just staying out of Trump's way. Maybe we don't need to take advantage of those opportunities. I think they do.
Thank you. Do you have any idea why the platform committee dropped the plank opposing subsidies to fossil fuel companies from final language? The DNC, Biden, and Harris had previously committed to stopping subsidies and tax incentives.
Okay. I don't know the answer to that. Obviously, I wasn't present for the platform committee hearings, but I suspect, well, let me take a step back. I think one of the really smart things that Biden and his campaign did after securing the nomination is they reached out to Bernie Sanders and to his supporters in any number of ways. The most tangible of which was setting up these policy task forces to come to some joint agreement on any number of issues that would be part of the platform and part of the Biden agenda. Sanders and his supporters didn't get everything they wanted, far from it. But the platform and the Biden policy agenda does bear significant influence from both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And I think the results of that outreach effort were apparent earlier this week when Sanders gave a much more forceful endorsement of Joe Biden than he had of Hillary Clinton 4 years ago. So I don't know how ultimately the platform committee came to the decision they did, but on balance, you do have a platform that probably is somewhat to the left of where Biden was during the primary. One other note that's worth paying attention to on this specific issue is it was reported on the Axios website just yesterday that Biden has decided not to pursue a carbon tax as a way of discouraging fossil fuel use and of raising revenues. It appears that, should he be elected, that a Biden administration would focus more on mandates than the type of taxes that are used here in California. That does appear to be a pretty large-scale victory for the Sanders and Warren voices in that discussion.
Thank you. Professor Schnur, do you have an updated perspective on the general election trend in the swing states like Florida, Pennsylvania, and Arizona? Excuse me.
Well, so over the course of the conventions, most of the major media platforms and other respected polling sources hold off on public opinion research because they recognize that there's so much political news being transmitted every day throughout the 2 weeks of the conventions that's a little bit volatile to keep track of. That said, the week before the convention, we saw new polls out both nationally and in those key swing states. In Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, the states that determined the election 4 years ago, as well as states like North Carolina and Arizona and Florida that look like they'll play an equally critical role this year. And I think what we're seeing is that the lead that Biden built over the spring and summer, nationally either low double digits, or excuse me, high single digits or low double digits, is been compromised a little bit. Biden's support is a little bit lower. And similarly, we're seeing a little bit of shrinkage in those swing states, with the exception of one CNN poll that tends to be, that seems to be a little bit more of an outlier from the others that have come out. Biden's lead, both nationally and in those states, is still outside the margin of error, but it is slightly smaller. Most public opinion polls now will shift from polling all voters to polling likely voters once the conventions are over. And what we know from past election years is that Republicans tend to be much more reliable voters. They tend to be much more consistent voters. So often when you do switch from a survey that polls everyone who's registered to vote to only those people who say that they are likely to vote, that generally favors Republicans. We did see a couple polls that made that shift, including the Washington Post ABC poll last week that shifted to likely voters. And we saw that Biden's lead maintained. It did not shrink, as normally happens when that shift takes place, would suggest that while Biden's base is still not as motivated as Trump supporters, as we've talked about many times in the past, it does appear that Biden is beginning to close that motivational gap, and we'll see in a couple of weeks whether the conventions continued that trend or not.
Thank you. This is kind of a two follow-ups to what you just said. Can this week's enthusiasm from the DNC convention last beyond the RNC convention, and do you expect to see a post-convention bump?
Okay. One of the advantages that the party that holds the White House possesses is, just like in baseball, the home team bats last. Well, in politics, if your party holds the White House, your convention comes second. And what that normally means is, on a relatively even playing field, the first party, the out party that gets a bounce out of their convention, sees that bounce sort of balance out, somewhat dissipate after the other party has gone. There's no way to predict whether that's going to be the case this year or not. But generally speaking, political parties do see a spike in their support immediately after the convention, because these two are coming in successive weeks rather than with a little bit more space between them, which is often the case. That means that spike won't last as long, and I wouldn't be comfortable predicting, at least not until I've seen the end of this week's convention and seen all of next week's, which party will have achieved a greater level of increased support as a result of the convention. But more often than not, they tend to balance each other out.
Thank you. Any predictions as to how the Republicans will counter the abbreviated virtual Democratic convention with their convention?
We don't know. And it's a great question, because the Democrats decided months ago that they were going to be moving to first a partially online convention, and then after that to a completely online convention. And as I think all of you know, President Trump made it clear over most of that time period that he still believed it would be possible to have a traditional in-person convention, first in North Carolina and then later in Jacksonville, Florida. So the Republicans simply have not had nearly as much time to prepare for a virtual convention the way the Democrats have, and that may put them at a disadvantage. We don't know. For all I know, there's been a great deal of work going on behind the scenes in terms of these preparations. But what is clear to me, at least from this week, is that the Democrats have benefited from how much time and thought they have put in to putting together a program that can maximize the opportunity of an online convention. We don't know if the Republicans will be able to or not. One thought I'd offer you on this, though, as we've talked about many times before in this webinar, while Joe Biden's priority in terms of targeting voters tends to be reaching out to vote undecided voters in the middle, Trump from the very beginning, not just of this campaign, but from his previous campaign in 2015 and 2016, by far has put most, if not all, of his time and effort into motivating his existing most loyal base of support. So as you watch the Republican convention next week, depending on where you fall on the political spectrum, left, center, or right, know that a Republican convention is almost certainly less likely to try to appeal to the political center than it is to try to motivate and inspire their most loyal conservative base. Two different goals. And so it's not going to be surprising that the two conventions will look very different.
Thank you. Do you think any other past presidents, including Bush, might speak up prior to the election about Trump's presidency's failures?
Well, so far, both Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton spoke out this week, as did Barack Obama, as we've talked about earlier. The only other living ex-president is George W. Bush. And so the question is whether he will speak out more forcefully, and we do not know the answer to that. Jeb Bush, his brother who ran unsuccessfully for the Republican nomination in 2016, has been much more vocal in his criticism of Trump than former President Bush has. But George W. Bush made it clear when he left office and was succeeded by Barack Obama back in 2009 that he felt it was inappropriate for a president to continue to engage in the political conversation. He said that he appreciated that Bill Clinton and other previous presidents had, by and large, ceded the stage to him when he held the office, and he tried very hard to do the same thing during President Obama's 2 terms. Bush, in any number of ways, has made it clear he doesn't care for Donald Trump. It became known in 2016 that Bush did not vote for Trump, although it was not disclosed who he did vote for. And while George W. Bush has been very active in terms of raising money for Republican Senate and congressional candidates, he's been much more quiet when it comes to the presidential reelection campaign. There's no, I don't know for a fact that George W. Bush will not speak out more aggressively against Trump. But if he does, it would be a decided turn from the tack that he's decided to take over the last 5 years.
Thank you. What impact do you believe Trump's embrace of, or at least his refusal to denounce QAnon will have upon his reelection prospects?
Right. As many of you probably saw, yesterday the president was asked a question about the QAnon movement, which has alleged some very incendiary things about the U.S. government and any number of other topics. The organization is on an FBI watch list. Its users have been banned from Facebook and other social media platforms. Trump not only did not denounce them, he was very careful not to praise the organization for its stated goals. But he did not criticize them and went out of his way to talk about them in a very broad, positive way. His essential message was, they like me and support me, which is a really good thing. Leaving himself enough room, as he did 4 years ago when David Duke endorsed his candidacy, to distance himself if need be. But there are a lot of suspicions that he was attempting to send quiet signals to QAnon advocates, many of whom have also become very forceful advocates of his reelection. So he's trying to walk the line between not praising their most outrageous and most unfortunate positions while still welcoming their support. We'll see if that's a balancing act that can sustain for the next 75 days.
Thank you. Would the protests in Portland and other states have some damage on the Democratic Party?
This is a real potential threat for Biden. Although the news coverage of the demonstrations in Portland has largely subsided over the last couple of weeks, those demonstrations aren't going away. And last night in particular was yet another night where there's been a decent amount of violence. There's also been violence and looting in Chicago and in other cities around the country. And as we've talked about on this webinar before, the law and order issue that Trump has been forwarding does have some resonance, particularly with a lot of the voter groups he's lost to Biden, particularly older voters and suburban voters. And footage of unrest, of windows breaking, of other types of similar behavior in Portland, in Chicago, and elsewhere is the type of footage that the Trump campaign can use to their benefit to remind these key voter groups that while the overwhelming majority of demonstrations and protests over the last few months have been peaceful, not all have. And that creates a platform to talk in a more aggressive way about the importance of law and order policy.
Thank you. So how many swing voters of either party are likely to have seen the speeches the last few days?
Probably not that many. Yeah, we mentioned earlier that the viewership of the convention is way down from 4 years ago, and that viewership has become smaller over each of the 3 nights of the convention. But it is worth noting, and we'll talk about the same thing in September and October when it comes time for the presidential debates. Most Americans don't input these news events in real time in their entirety. The majority of them, large majorities of them, not just young people, but voters of all ages, tend to rely on news coverage and social media discussion of those events. So just like the conventions draw a smaller audience, but a lot of people, most people, are going to, even if they haven't seen the whole thing, are going to pick up snippets, online videos, news broadcast and print coverage. And so sort of that second generation information receptors is how most people will learn about the presidential election. What we don't know yet and won't know until both are over is not just how many viewers the 2 conventions drew, but how that second and third generation information sharing penetrated the American public.
Thank you. This question is, why are Latino voters so reluctant to vote? I work with several who are citizens, but they won't vote.
Well, this is a critically important question. I think there are a couple of things worth paying attention to. One is because we've heard so much language over the last few years and before about a federal government taking a variety of actions against undocumented immigrants. Many voters who come from other countries, Latino, Asian Pacific, and other, whether they are here with documentation or not, have some suspicion about the way the federal government engages with their communities. We've seen a similar reluctance from many Latino communities to participate in the census, because even though the people who run the census have been made clear that this information will not be shared with other arms of the government, it's understandable that many people, particularly those here without documentation, but also those who are here legally, might not be willing to simply take the census's word for it. So part of it is sort of a conflation, if you will, with the ongoing debate over undocumented immigration and a concern among many in Latino and Asian Pacific communities that even with documentation, this is something that could potentially make them vulnerable in unforeseen ways. But I think there's another aspect to this as well, and it became particularly noticeable last night when the governor of New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, spoke. And what was notable to me is how few Latino and Latina speakers were on the convention stage over the last few days. While the party is putting a huge amount of time and effort into mobilizing and motivating African American support, and obviously African American voters were the key to Biden's primary victory, Biden's support among the Latinx population is actually slightly lower than Hillary Clinton's was in 2016. And just as there's probably a benefit in Biden making more of an effort to reach out to and motivate young people, it's probably not a bad idea for them to do the same thing with Latino and Latina voters as well.
Thank you. This comment and question, as a young person, a lot of these questions from older audiences are very out of touch with how involved the youth is with politics. Even in social media, there is consistent conversations and clips about political news that their parents are watching on TV. Young people will do whatever it takes to vote. They usually need to convince their parents to go out and vote. As we know, 40+% went out to vote in 2016 and 2018. Dan, do you think millennials and their parents should be voting by mail early on, or figuring out how to go to the polls during this COVID time?
So two great points. I'll take the second one first because it's so much easier. Yes, everyone, young people, older people, all people should return their absentee ballot as early as possible, whether it's by mailing it back in or taking it to a voting center. Don't wait until election day. Don't wait until the week before the election, because while on one hand there is a temptation to want to wait to see news that becomes available over the remaining days of the campaign, there's been so much controversy and there were so many questions about the Postal Service's ability to get these votes back to the appropriate authorities in time. The sooner you do it, the better. But the questioner, and this is probably a pretty good place to wind up today's conversation, makes a great point about young people. As many of you know, I've devoted the last many, many years of my life to working with some incredible young leaders at UC Berkeley, at University of Southern California, at Pepperdine University, and through a number of community organizations. And I get to work with those who, like the questioner, are most motivated and most engaged and most excited about having their voices heard. But statistics, and the questioner, I say this isn't my opinion, statistics demonstrate that young people simply do vote in much smaller numbers than voters of other generations. Now that said, and this for my fellow old people, while those young people, like our questioner, vote in smaller numbers than our generations do, those same generation X and millennial members, they volunteer their time back into their community at greater levels than any other generation in America today or in recent American history. So I wouldn't suggest for a moment that young people don't care about their communities and don't care about the future. But what the data shows is that they are much more willing to demonstrate their concern and their interest and their involvement through volunteering and through other types of community service than through voting. And what I tell my students every single semester, and I'll tell the ones this year as well, is I'll tell them that volunteering is admirable, volunteering is noble, but ultimately if you want to make a change, you can't clean up enough parks on your own. And so ultimately, in addition to that laudable volunteering, you got to vote too. It's not an either or, it's a both. And one of the greatest challenges, not just for the Biden campaign, but I would argue candidates of all parties and all ideologies, is convincing young people who've been so turned off on traditional politics that it is worth re-engaging, that politics is too important to be left to the politicians, and that if they can take at least a portion of that energy that they devote to volunteering and the protests and to demonstrations to cast a ballot. That's ultimately in everybody's best interest.
Awesome. Dan, thank you so much. We got through a lot of questions. I know we had so many more, so I apologize to those I couldn't get to, but thank you so much. And Kim, I'm going to turn the conversation back over to you. Thanks.
Dan, informative, terrific, interesting, on the seat of my pants, for the tonight's Biden talk. So thank you. Thank you as always. We appreciate everything you do. You know, for our viewers, we're offering these live streams free of charge as a public service. So if you're enjoying politics in the time of coronavirus and all of our other live streams, we need your support. So please type the name Schnur, S-C-H-N-U-R, Schnur, in honor of Dan, to the number on the screen, and please give what you can. We can't do this without your support. So please help us out. And then we have a terrific lineup of live streams through the rest of the year. Please go to our website at lawac.org to see how you can register, become a member, or make a donation. Everybody, please stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you next week. Thank you. Thank you, Dan, so much.